All right, here we are for another show of Around the Coin. There was a good bit of feedback I got last time that we should do a quick introduction. So just so folks listening can identify different voices. My name is Mike Townsend. I've been a startup founder for my 10 years, 15 years, 12 years after graduating college. Brian, why don't you give us a quick little intro, and then Faisal, and then we'll jump into today's topic, which is, it's a juicy show we have lined up. Brian?
Thank you, Michael. This is Brian Romley. I talk about money, and I talk to computers, and they talk back.
And good morning. My name is Faisal Khan. I'm a banking and a payment consultant. I absolutely value the time that I get to spend with these two wonderful gentlemen and, bring this podcast to you.
Yeah, and a couple quick shout outs. We had a couple of listeners, I want to say the name as best I can, Kevin McKernan, who is a longtime supporter of the show and gave great feedback. Scott Dueweke and Shahid Sharif gave us great feedback on the show, and just want
I love those guys. They're always giving us information. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Scott's a good friend, so shout out to Scott as well.
So, Faisal, I'll kick it off to you to start us off. We're generally keeping on this theme of, I'll almost just pass the baton to you. Why don't you give your story that we talked about pre-show and how you see things, because I find it fascinating.
So we were discussing about, obviously, information, and we were discussing about countries. And, I just came back literally as we are recording this show about less than an hour ago from a visit to the Baltics. I went to Lithuania and Estonia, and we were discussing many things, how, information and proper information has led these two countries to be at the forefront. And we'll come to that. But, the conversation sort of diverted between Brian, Mike, and myself into why, no one really understands how things work. And it's literally in the vested interests of established organizations, the incumbents, not to make it so. And one of the things, we talked about is why is it that really no one understands how money works? And, I was explaining to Mike what really commercial money is all about, how it's created, how 97% of all the money is literally commercial money, and commercial money means basically it's created out of thin air. There is nothing to back it up except the bank that is creating it. And I think even for Mike himself, he was taken a little back. Wouldn't you say so?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think of it just really as groups of people making loans to each other. Mm-hmm. But then you put a name like commercial bank around it and a bunch of regulations, and it sounds like a distant concept.
So again, there's a great documentary. It's called How Money is Created. It's absolutely a must-watch. And I want to quote from the opening scene. I've actually written the quote down. I've used it in my talks and so forth. I'll paraphrase a little bit, but here is the basic quote. And it goes like something like this. There is no system that is taken for granted or misunderstood as much as the monetary system. Taking on really nearly religious proportions, the established monetary institutions exist as one of the most unquestioned forms of faith there is. How money is created, the policies by which it is governed, how it is truly affecting our society are unregistered interests of great majority of the population. And whether we are aware of it or not, the lifeblood of all our established institutions, and thus society itself, is money. Therefore, understanding this institution of monetary policy is critical to understanding why our lives are the way they are. Unfortunately, economics is often viewed with confusion and boredom. Endless streams of financial jargon coupled with intimidating mathematics quickly deters people from any attempt at understanding. However, the fact really is the complexity is so seated within the financial system, it is a mere mask designed to conceal one of the most socially paralyzing structures humanity has ever endured. Unquote.
Wow. So how do you digest that? I basically hear that and think this is too overwhelming of a topic for people, for the masses by design, and therefore making it so complex that no one either has the confidence to contribute to it in a meaningful way, say an innovative way, like starting another company, or even questioning it as a consumer, which leads to some potentially scary outcomes.
So I have friends who are, and these are childhood friends, people I've grown up with, people I've played soccer and, God knows what, bicycling in the streets, etc. And they are now presidents of banks, literally the president of banks. And they have no idea what commercial money is. I mean, that is how big of a problem it is. They are so ingrained in the Kool-Aid that they are drinking that Brian and me, we always, and I'll get Brian's comment on this thing. So, we get termed conspiracy theorist. And the answer is not a conspiracy theorist. It's you're simply less informed. I have a friend of mine. I just want to say this. I have a friend of mine. I learned so much from him. And one day he was saying something, and I was, arguing. I said, "Oh, well, that's just conspiracy theory." And he says, "You have a son, right?" I said, "Yeah." He says, 5 years old. He says, "Yeah." He said, "Why don't you discuss, electromagnetics or quantum electrodynamics with him?" I said, "Why would I?" He says, "Exactly. That's exactly how you are right now in front of me, a 5-year-old. You're less informed, and because you're less informed, you can't hold up an argument."
Well, little do you know, I debate 5-year-olds on electromechanics all day, so it can be done. And when you say you have a friend who is the president of a commercial bank and they don't understand commercial money or commercial lending, how is that possible? Is there?
So it's not just one friend, not two, three. I have three of them, and I have, in very normal conversations, brought this up with them. And when I sort of probe them further, I see a lot of kickback. I see a lot of resistance. There's often an attempt to change the subject. Okay, fine. I thought maybe not the right setting this time, but I've done it 2-3 times, and every time it's the same thing, which leads me to a generalized population, assumption that all three of them don't know how it really works.
What do you think that they don't understand? I'm sure that they get that that the money is created by the bank in terms of lending. So if I lend someone money, it's money I had to have had. So
again, what I think that they don't understand is that when they simply debit your account or credit your account with a loan, a newly created loan, they're assuming that they have a collateral for it, and that collateral somehow is being balanced by what the central bank's deposits. They'll somehow mix it to the reserves that they have, and based on those reserves and the ratios, this is what they're lending. But when you really probe, okay, fine, that I don't know, $50,000 or $100,000 or $10,000 that you are crediting in someone's account, show me where it's coming from. The minute you say that, show me where this was parked before it came here. That's where the conversation gets murky, and it's a very simple question, right? It's a very simple question.
Wouldn't that be written off? Wouldn't that be debt though? Wouldn't the banks write it off as debt? Effectively that they owe
to themselves.
That they owe yeah, they'd have to take credit out of somewhere, right? Because the Federal Reserve is the only one that prints money.
Well, you're assuming. Where the problem is only U.S. concentric. It's the same thing everywhere in the world. And the Federal Reserve or not doesn't apply over here. Printing commercial money. That's what commercial banks are for. Where does that term come in from? Commercial banks. What is the other bank? Are they not commercial in the same sense? They're not
private.
They're not allowed to do commercial money.
Or when you say commercial money, that is money that can be loaned out to any individual in society.
Yep.
So just to narrow in on the real crux of the story here, that's the juicy part, is if a commercial bank were to loan out money to one of their patrons, one of the customers, they are creating that money they're creating that debt. So it's like a company issuing its own debt to itself.
Absolutely. That money is not backed by the reserves, which is what the contrary or popular opinion may say. So, no, but it's actually coming from the reserves. It's not. It's just a computer credit into your account with the future receivable that is locked in for paying that credit off.
But in that case, aren't they literally creating money?
Yes,
I mean,
yes,
if
yes.
it's just digital,
That is why the license says commercial banking license. They're giving, the central bank gives the commercial banks the license to print money.
interesting. So I mean, in addition
And
to the
this is not a conspiracy. It's a matter of fact. Like it is like 2 plus 2 is 4, and we have there's a sun at the center of our solar system.
yeah,
This
it's
is
really happening.
It is a very normal thing in the industry. The fact of the matter is they just don't teach it in the basic accounting 101.
And now, isn't there laws set in place where I know banking is heavily regulated? Isn't there laws that say, as a bank, you can only loan out 8 or 9 times what the Federal Reserve gives you in terms of cash flow?
There is no law. That's just a mathematical limit of lending. There's no law as such. It just says that you have to have 10% of the reserves kept in, and when you take 10% of the reserves out and you loan the 90%, you keep 10% of that and loan the 90%. You can only do it 9 times. That's it. So that's it's just simple mathematics. I mean, these things are not. I don't know, Brian, help me out. What's the word I'm looking for? This is not like, spooky or alien infested thoughts.
Yeah, no. I don't think there is. I think it's just it's a topic that most people, myself included, don't typically go down. It's a rabbit hole people don't go down because it doesn't typically affect our day-to-day lives. So I don't think there's much of a claim that it's not happening. I think it's just, oh, that's interesting. That's something I didn't realize was happening. How does that affect our day-to-day life? And frankly, I think about, by default, is there a business opportunity there to somehow create something better than what exists using better and different technology? But I mean, what we're talking about pre-show is that there's this inherent resistance from the incumbents to protect their space. Their barrier to entry is the regulation. For startups, it's difficult to create a bank because there's so much regulation, so much red tape saying this is exactly how the bank has to look and operate. So it kind of puts handcuffs on the abilities to create a different type of user experience or lending model. And that's good and bad. It may protect bad actors or people taking on too much risk that they then go bankrupt and then cost society money somehow. But in the other sense, it does prevent innovative concepts from developing. So I would think that you would agree with me when I say that banking generally is pretty stuck. It's kind of rigid. The ACH system hasn't changed in decades. There's no the weekends I can't send people money. It's archaic in a way under the hood, technology wise. So I don't know what you guys think about that. If that's a space that cryptocurrency can come and make meaningful change in how people bank, or how that plays out.
Well, I want to get back to the original premise of how we started the conversation, and we are assuming that the way money is formed and the way money is loaned has no day-to-day impact on life, and that's patently false. It does. It absolutely does. If we were around in 1900 and we had $100, right, it would be worth essentially $2,945 today. Okay, but the value of that money is almost worthless, meaning what the buying power of that money is. So a loaf of bread in around 1900 was just a few pennies. The loaf of bread today is a few dollars. So if you held the money in an interest-bearing account, because of the way we form money and because we have a debt-based economy and because of inflation, you're literally losing the value of that money while it's being protected, if you will. And that's one of the fundamental reasons on why Bitcoin was formed. It was formed based on this notion that the inflation within the economy is such that it takes away the value that somebody created quite rapidly. And we really don't sense it. We don't sense it because it's the slow pot of boiling water, right? You don't feel it until it's really too late. And too late really means that the trillions of dollars of debt at some point is going to reach a zenith point, an omega point. And essentially what will happen is all of the institutions that we relied upon are going to fail us. There's no equivocation about it. There's no perpetual motion of money. And I've also talked quite deeply in this show also about the idea of precious metals. The precious metal used to be, or semi-precious, anything that was precious, used to be a way to hold on to wealth and value. And a lot of people think that is esoteric, but it's not the case. There's trillions of dollars of wealth held still in precious metals today. And people are reliant upon that to sustain through inflation, meaning that if they held it in a bank, it'd be worthless in some case, a certain amount of money, whereas if it's held in precious metals, it can skyrocket in value. If we wind up mining an Apollo armor satellite, or let's call it an asteroid close to the Earth, this is near Earth heavenly bodies that have more gold and platinum than ever can be found on this planet, then there is no such thing as precious metal, gold, or platinum. Now, again, a lot of people start glazing over and say, oh, that's some point in the future, it doesn't affect my life. In reality, it does. In reality, it's probably going to affect the life of everybody listening to me right now. Then the question is, where does one put their money where they can be sure that its value will sustain no matter what the economic outcomes around them are? And that question leads to mathematics, and it leads to Bitcoin. It's something that can be unadulterated to a certain level until we get to quantum superiority, and that's something else. But my basic premise is everything we're talking about right now, and what Faisal just brilliantly presented, affects you at this moment. You just don't know it. It still looks esoteric even when I'm done muttering about it. But really think about the idea of how inflation works. And I just go on and look at the inflation calculators that you can mess with a Google search, and you can start seeing what's going on. We're going to be in our lifetime $10 for a loaf of bread in the United States. That's going to happen. And a lot of people say, well, Brian, that's not possible. Tell that to somebody who thought $1 a loaf of bread. People
what do you
still
think
alive
about
today.
Brian, how do you I'm just curious how you contemplate this idea. So the one call it a track for inflation would be to say that whatever money was in circulation in the, say, year 1900, that represents a certain human energy. So there's energy that goes into production, into consumption, and that energy I could trade, if I worked at dollars per hour, $10 per hour, $15 per hour working at McDonald's, there's just a literal trade for human output to money. Now, some people create businesses and sell businesses, but even a business just represents a collection of humans doing things and the energy that's produced by their intelligent output. So as we progress, as humans develop more and more complex societies and become more productive to make things, the cost of what it cost to produce a loaf of bread 100 years ago, that cost is worth less than it is today. So someone might have spent an hour.
Why does it cost more? Why does it cost more?
Well, it would cost less, right? The dollars would go up, but per inflation, it would cost less. So if I worked
okay, so you're
hours,
saying the amount of time you need to work to get a loaf of bread, right?
Right, because salaries are also rising because the incomes go up. So therefore, the relative cost that I pay in terms of my time, it goes down for a loaf of bread.
You would think that, but that's not actually the case. You would think that everything is commensurate to the amount of effort you get into let's say 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, what can the average person afford? Well, the Industrial Revolution created the middle class. There really wasn't a middle class. The de-industrial revolution is eliminating the middle class. The middle class in all of the Western worlds, except temporarily in China, and that's slowly decaying, is being eliminated. And it's precisely for the exact same reasons that you're stating. Even though the cost to produce a loaf of bread through a mechanized system, and in the future through an artificial intelligence robotics-based system, is inordinately magnitudes less in cost, the amount that you need to pay of your time to get access to that food product is skyrocketing. It is skyrocketing in the relativity over time.
A loaf of bread, for instance, may have taken, you make it in an urn. It may have taken 1 hour of human time to make a loaf of bread. So let's look at it instead of dollars. Let's look at human energy. So 1 hour takes human bread. Now it might take, for me to get a loaf of bread in my refrigerator, it takes me 10 minutes to order on Instacart. It costs, me equivalent of like maybe 5 minutes of my working hour. It costs far less. The person who's making the bread can make 10,000 loaves of bread in an hour because they're using giant machines that ship it to here. So the efficiencies have gone up dramatically for base things, bread, water, shelter, things we absolutely need to live. And now we're spending money on traveling. We're spending our energy that we've worked to gather, our money, on traveling, on entertainment, on movies, on things that we want to, on VR headsets, right? In-game purchases of VR headsets. These things it'll never end. There'll always be something to spend money on. But the core foundation of what it takes to live, food, shelter, those things have gone down dramatically in relative energy.
I don't know if I can fully agree with that when you really, because we're kind of comparing apples to oranges to a certain extent. Let's just put it from this perspective. It is true. It appears that let's just say, we're going to personal production of bread, and that's not really the proper comparison. Let's talk to when bread was mechanized for its first time, when you would buy it from a baker, because that's really what we're talking about. Personal production of anything is going to obviously take more of your time because you have to do it. So you're trading time for money. So now we go into, when did humans first started trading time for money for bread? Now, I can go way back, but let's go just to the pre-industrial revolution. And it was inordinately cheap. I mean, we're talking, let's just say we can go to early 1800s, talking about a penny a loaf of bread. Now, I might say, well, people were paid a lot less, and that was equal to. No, you're actually paying a lot more for a loaf of bread for the amount of time that you normally get paid for in your day. And it doesn't make any sense when you consider the cost of scales and things of that level. The sense comes from the inflation aspect of it. And we're mixing a couple of metaphors because we're talking about production and time, and we're also talking the value of money. But, I also don't want to make this go into too much minutia. The bottom line is one can sense that their purchasing power of the money they accumulate is decreasing over time. And if it just sits in a bank account, it ultimately will become worthless. At some point in time, if you had what was a small fortune and you let it generationally sit in a bank account, and let's assume we don't get high interest rates again, which it's unlikely that we will.
Now, I'd almost argue that that's a good thing, right? There is pressure, there is incentive, financial incentive to put money to work, to invest it, to spend it,
that's called
to
risk.
not have it sit there.
Well, that's called risk capital. And as you get older, what you start looking at is you start contemplating your future and generations. And the very, very wealthy have access to a number of mechanisms that allow them to preserve their wealth. That's why they buy art. That's why they buy, wine and things like that. And they're very educated and of course, they're preserving their wealth. But the average person, the people that we're speaking to right now, don't think in those terms. And that's why we're having this conversation. I mean, we could talk about it in esoteric levels of saying, keep your money moving. That's fine. But tell that to somebody who's accumulating a lot of money to try to make it safe for their future generations, to try to have some legacy. You're now saying you need to risk your capital. You need to keep it. We talked about this in prior show, currency, movement. Yes, of course. But you also want to pursue safety. And at one point in time, the bank did represent the ultimate form of safety, perhaps. But it also represents the ultimate form of a lack of return of investment. It's a negative investment. And it hasn't been that way until just relatively recently in the creation of money. We're talking about the last 30 years, and especially the last 10 years, you can get an incredibly negative return just by letting your money sit in a bank. And that is an unsustainable scenario. It makes everybody into a risk taker. It makes everybody, it's like, come on, join us into this. Well, yeah, join us. But how do you have time working maybe, 3 double shifts to try to figure this stuff out? Well, I'll get a money manager. Well, a lot of those people are guessing too. So to get your measly 3%.
Yeah, again, it's the system, right? I mean, the financial system is so convoluted and complex that an average person who is barely struggling to meet, make ends meet and pay the bills is financially, as what they call it, quote unquote, illiterate. Well, why is he illiterate? Well, the reason he's illiterate is because the financial institution system has made it so exceedingly complex that it takes almost an institution to understand it, and even people within the institution don't understand it. So trying to make ends meet with your meager salary, or even if you're making a good salary, and if you're making a good salary, well, darn it, why aren't you investing it with our financial products?
Faisal, do you think that the international access of just opening the door to either banks, cryptocurrencies in other countries, that we're going to develop such specialization in different countries that it'll sort of break down this dominating impact that the United States banking and regulation system has? Do you see that happening? And we were talking a bit about this pre-show with Latvia being kind of almost like the Delaware of the world in terms of their ability to help crypto companies.
The crypto thing is obviously happening. We are in a winter right now, so to speak. I think we're going to be shedding off our first layer of skin. We're hibernating in many cases, but I think the crypto thing is there. The technology is there. I mean, I read Satoshi Nakamoto's paper just the other day. Just one of those, refresher things that you want to read again, and it just gives me goosebumps all over. There is an unbundling. That's the word I want. An unbundling of my wealth from the financial system, and I can keep it with me. And when you have that, the financial system is at risk. Having said that, this is something very new. So it is literally the meeting of the two oceans, the salt ocean and the freshwater ocean, right? So, the incumbents, the old school, is going to try to dominate it. The libertarians, the free thought society, the people who really believe that wealth should be free to move and should be in our own hands will try to dominate it. We'll see where it goes. But what really came out was these two countries in the Baltics. The Baltics are the north, they're towards the northeast of Europe. 4 countries. I think it's Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Belarus. And Estonia and Lithuania in particular they're part of the EU, the European Union, and they have a very small population. Lithuania has a population of 2 million people total, and Estonia has a population of 1.3 million people total. But yet they don't have brain drain. But they don't have any other product, right? So what they've done is, with the public-private partnership that they have, the government and the people, the businesses, have said, okay, how can we go at the forefront of what is happening today? And what they're doing is they've literally become the Delaware for all things crypto and financial or e-money licenses or monetary licenses or digital banking licenses. These were countries that people had to Google where they were. They have a lot of preconceived notion as to what these countries are. I just visited them today. I came back from there, so after spending about almost a week over there. And I'm blown away. And the fact of the matter is that they are now issuing more digital banking licenses than anyone else combined together. They have issued more e-money licenses than anyone combined together. After the United Kingdom, they have the most. Lithuania has the most e-money licenses. Lithuania also has the most digital banking licenses. So I think there's a tremendous activity that is happening over there that we need to really understand. That why are these countries at the forefront? Why have they embraced it? And why are we, the existing countries, the United States, UK, France, Germany, etc., Switzerland, are at the back? And the reason is because these countries have seen the winds of change, and they're going to ride that wave, whether we like it or not. And they have many initiatives. Estonia has something called an e-residency. Everything, by the way, in Estonia, every single thing is online. And you say, oh wow, everything is online, so cool. Well, what you don't know, it was a 20-year effort to get them there. One really has to go there and see all your medical records are online. Every single dental scan you've done is online. You don't have to carry files with you to the doctor. They're just all online. You go to the doctor and he can bring them up. Same thing with insurance, same thing with rental agreements. Everything is online. You really have to go and see how these countries are changing and challenging the existing norms and the incumbents.
Yeah, that's a great example.
And I think it's only going to grow. We are in the cold winter. The cold winter of cryptocurrency was established because there was the first round of speculation, and it's drawing out what Warren Buffett would say, the people who are not wearing pants when the water is gone from the beach. So at this point, it's a natural and very vital process that's necessary. From the perspective of us Bitcoin miners, it's the best thing that could possibly happen. It is shaking the whole mining equation. The people that got involved in it on a mass scale to try to corner the market, they're out of business. Some of the companies that built some of the very early, well, not the very early, the latest ASIC miner chips are now struggling in the case of Bitman. And so it's an interesting time. The beauty of it is that folks that are leaving in droves have not studied history, and they now think it's all an invalid concept. It's all going to go away. And the fact is, some of the machinations of alternative currencies and what people did, and I'm sad to say some of the smart contract constructs that were put out there were entirely false. And so some of that needs to drain from the idea, the mind share. I'm a strong proponent of blockchain/Bitcoin for a number of reasons. Bitcoin as a wealth preservation system will be, bar none, the most useful tool given to the average person that we've ever seen since the beginning of the concept of money, or in some cases, let's say trade. As far as the long-term effect of blockchain, in effect, all we have is a really highly controlled public database that's encrypted. And there's nothing really all that mystical or new about it. I mean, we could talk about it in mystical ways. It's really an extension of what computers have been doing since we started. It's just an inversion on where it's centrally located and how we get access to it and what kind of information can be stored. And the creativity of what we do with it, I don't think we've touched the surface. I think a lot of people were going after the low-hanging fruit. The market wasn't quite there yet, and they're running to the hills doing something else, and that's perfectly fine. There are a few companies that I do think get it. There are certainly a lot of people who made money creating essentially what Faisal was talking about, money out of thin air. Fortunately, we didn't tell anybody to invest in any ICO, but a lot of people invested in ICOs, and I think they did it under the wrong premise. And when the money value creation evaporated, they were stuck. And I'm not saying that those concepts are invalid. I'm just saying you set up the perfect storm to be regulated. Whoever had the wonderful idea to do all these things, they wondered, nobody's stopping us. Wow, we're going to go crazy. And all of these folks that were running around, I'm sure, Faisal, you know them. Mike, you know them. For the last 14 months, ICO, it's taking over. And I tried publicly and privately. We weren't on very much, fortunately, because I would have been demanding people to stop their crap. But they didn't. So they got what they feared most, is the arm of regulation. And it's just starting, because that's how it works. And people fail to realize that. Mark Zuckerberg is realizing what move fast and break things really mean in 2019. And
Brian, would you agree though? I'm just curious on this point. So there's naturally going to be this idea of a synthesis, an antithesis, or thesis synthesis. It's a thesis, antithesis, and then
Synthesis.
Oh boy, synthesis. All right.
Yeah.
So basically, your initial proposition, the counterpoint, the counterforce, and then you're somewhere left in the middle. The pendulum swings one way, it swings the other, and then it settles in the middle. So cryptocurrency
assuming there's a steady state. There's no steady state in this.
There's no steady state, but generally these are the way societal motions move.
Yeah.
Whether it's civil rights, whether it's cryptocurrency becoming adopted into the world and becoming a mainstream idea, regulation at its whole pushes back. So I'd almost say that in some ways we needed a pushback, and the ICOs was kind of a quick, 4-month, 6-month sprint. Came out and things exploded, and then people got upset. The prices
and people
dropped.
got arrested. Remember, we talked about this in our last few shows.
But it almost feels the right amount of pushing in that direction. It didn't go on for decades. It wasn't severe enough to where people's lives were lost or people got into wars over countries fought. None of that happened. So in some ways, I view it as a really beautiful stopping point, checkpoint to assess what kind of rules we want to set in place for ourselves as a society.
On a whole, I would agree, but I'd like to hear Faisal's view on the fact that this will never be steady state, because the fact is we're looking at technology evolution and revolution, and it's sort of unlike what we've seen in history because this is digital evolution, not mechanized evolution. Make sense?
It does, and I don't know if this is what libertarian, contrarian, Aryan, I don't know what view this is, but I feel that we have more. I play the world back, let's say the last 2,000 years as a movie, right? As a 160-second movie, and I see this person called humanity sitting with a small book. Then I see a person of humanity sitting with 2 small books, and then 3 small books, and then I see 4 or 5 people, but they're all separate. And then I see all the books. The information is getting larger and larger and larger. Do you know how much information we are collecting every single day just through our mobile phones? I was sitting at the airport today, myself included, guilty, yes, absolutely. Everyone was taking pictures of planes, etc. Where is all this information going? And we are talking, we are sending voice messages, etc., etc. But we're doing this massively on the data scale. And I feel at some point in time, the spillovers are going to come into the value scale of how we do banking and payments and so forth. And when they start getting decentralized, but they will still be centralized. We didn't really get a decentralized email service, did we? We sort of settled down to centralized services. Most of us use Gmail, Hotmail, Yahoo, whatever, etc., right? MSN, etc. So I feel that because of this, we are very well connected and we know what it is out there, but it is so much information that we're back to square one. First, there was the argument there is no information. Now we have too much information.
Exactly, and I allude this a lot in my talks about data and wisdom. Data is the very bottom of the pyramid. Wisdom is the very top of the pyramid. Where we are awash in data and maybe some information, but we are lacking insight, knowledge, and wisdom. And so it was once thought that if we had all of the data of the world, that somehow we'd become more wiser. I ask anybody look around you whether or not you've seen an increase, a disproportionately large increase of wisdom in the last 20 years. You haven't. So
that's a really good point.
Here's an interesting thing. So let's assume a book is still relatively important to you. Let's assume reading a book is relatively important. Gentlemen, if you live to be 80, and I hope you live to be much longer, how many books could you read if you read a book a week? I'll answer it for you. 4,000 books. That's it. 4,000 books. If you go to a library, typical library, it's floor-to-ceiling shelves. That's about 6 shelves across. That's it. It's 4 gigabytes of data. Understand that. If it was text, it's only 4 gigabytes of data. The entire print collection of the Library of Congress, Alexandria is much larger actually in some ways, is 10 terabytes. It's not very large. In fact, all printed information in the world right at this moment is only 200 petabytes. So really, it's very important to try to get a relativity about information and what you learn. I have a lot of friends who are very proud that they read a book a week. I try to do significantly more than that, but not for this reason. It's just my relentless urge of curiosity. But it is not just the information that you get from the book. It's not the data you get from the book. It's the mnemonic that you create of all of that. It's symbolically as wisdom. Wisdom is a symbolic construct that humans can transfer between each other. And when you capture wisdom, you can actually do it in a couple of sentences. And if you trust that person giving you the wisdom, if they've earned that trust, and you've earned being a student, it's very, very crucially important. As we move forward into the future, if you really want to get wisdom, you have to earn the right to be a student. If you're just going to dip your hand into data and then come away saying that you now have a smattering, a patina of wisdom on you, I'm sorry to inform you, that patina is just a little bit of water on your hand. The student has to be rightly ready for the idea of being the receiver of true wisdom. And then the throughput and the bandwidth can be phenomenal. Then you can start saying, I really trust this source. I'm going to temporarily, I'm not saying you have to, but it's so much easier, temporarily put down my desire to push back, and I'm going to just receive this wisdom and try to figure out, is this valuable? And so now, instead of just being limited to 4 gigabytes of data, because that's all you'll ever get from the 4,000 books you read, and that's considered an inordinately high goal of reading 4,000 books in a lifetime.
I just want to read the same. I want to read the best 100 books over and over again. Well, I feel most people read the retention just to read the most books.
What if
overwhelmingly?
You can always do the videos, right? The YouTube videos. There are summarized versions. I mean, if you really just want to feel like, you could, right?
If you are getting the summary from the right person. See, wisdom is not just the data presented to you again. Wisdom is distilling that data through paradigms that allow you to understand them on a much more deeper level. You will remember that information if it's delivered as wisdom.
There are many books though that are not full of wisdom that people read that have they'll have 5 minutes of wisdom in 500 pages with anecdote after
here's
anecdote
the interesting
after
part.
Anecdote.
You can read a menu at a restaurant and derive wisdom even though there's no wisdom in the actual data. Wisdom is a human construct. It is very important to understand. Google does not deliver wisdom. Even if you're reading a book on wisdom, it doesn't deliver wisdom. Wisdom is entirely a human construct.
So humans I don't know, I forget the timeline when we first started inventing written language. That was probably 100,000 years ago. Does that sound about right? When we first
that's current historians. I think it was more like a million and a half years ago. But
so somewhere we'll call it a long time ago. Yeah. People started writing down their stories. Presumably, they had the ability to tell stories and communicate ideas generation after generation. I don't even think you have to presume that. That's pretty clear. Before you would write it down and subscribe it on a rock, right? That would be the first way to store it. But even then, it's very difficult, right? And then to actually record meaningful information, like first written language being debts that people owe each other and some kind of record keeping on related to finances. And then eventually we get into written word. And when written word first came around and the ability to write it on paper and share it on just have it in an archive, it separates for the first time the human story from your mind. And then what's archived somewhere else that you could just always have access to, but how often do you ever just randomly go on Wikipedia and read about things? So it's a difference between it's a difference between, again, randomly scrolling through information that we have access versus somehow developing a system. Societies throughout history, I think, the successful ones, really, particularly culturally successful, preserve the most important stories. Because it's not read the most books you can, get the most data you can, and somehow wisdom will happen. It's dial into the most important stories. If you think of great thinkers of our time and the stories they told and how they developed things like electricity and quantum mechanics, and just Einstein coming up with E equals MC squared as an output, was really started by a thought process and just saying, okay, what happens if this happens and that happens and this happens, and being able to walk through. Richard Feynman, I was watching some of his stuff the other night. He's just absolutely brilliant with describing what happens on a subatomic particle level, or even a particle level, and describing the way the world works is wisdom, right? Understanding the way things are around you, how the banking system works, how energy is transferred from a fire. What is a fire? What is ice? Why is ice slippery? All these basic things that you think, oh yeah, you intuitively know that it's true, but you don't know how it's true. Well, and I think this is kind of how I think of wisdom, which is preserved in
that's beautiful.
Not that many.
Yeah, let me give you a quick reason why this happened. It's very simple. And I gave this in my talk at the Alexit conference. I'll give a really quick overview. The only reason that let's start at this point. The highest level of death for women throughout the ages was childbirth. And only human females have this particular phenomenon. And why is that? There's only one reason. The human brain grew so large that can no longer pass easily through the birth canal. If you've ever been on a farm and you've seen birth being taking place, it's not a painful process. It's quick. It's almost like what just happened. A human female, it is an immensely painful process, and most women died. And a lot of people say, well, that's because you need doctors. That's not really the case. What happened was the growth of the human skull was such, and it continues to be such to a certain level, that we needed to almost delete 99% of our survival skills that are inherent in all other animals. Humans are born naked with no spikes and no claws. If we were not with our moms for the first 8 years of our life, we would die, period, end of story. So the question now remains, well, what happened? We gave up our short-term memory. Humans have the worst short-term memory of any primate species, and I can get into that some future date. Chimpanzees are thousands of times more able to remember short-term things than humans are. And what did we replace? Our short-term memory areas are now our communication centers. Humans are the only species that can communicate to this level. And there's only one reason why. Humans are the only species that can contemplate our own mortality. Because we discovered time, and I can go into a very interesting way we discovered time at a future show. Because Eve discovered time and passed that idea of time on to the Adamites, or Adam, we now contemplate our mortality. When we contemplate our mortality, we now do something fantastic. We're able to project the past into the future. The only way you can understand creative thinking is the beginning of it. And the beginning is mortality. When we said someday we will die, and somebody we cared about died, that's wisdom. That's a tremendous amount of wisdom. Said, what can I learn today that I can pass forward so that this offloaded archive we call communication, transmission of communication, can be saved? We did this through stories. Storytelling is all humans have ever done. It's all we will ever do. From Einstein's theory of relativity to allegorical stories in the past, humans are storytellers. Period.
Maybe the whole thing, Brian, is just a story. Maybe it's just all a giant story.
But I use the concept of story, and a lot of people delude themselves into thinking story means something made up. And they're absolutely right, but they're right in the wrong way. We're making up observations, empirical observations of what's around us. We're creating and constructing that data into wisdom, which is a story that we transfer forward.
Yeah. I mean, a story is real, but it's not physically manifested.
Exactly.
It's when you just experience, or when you go to a play and you watch the performers, or you go to a movie theater and you watch the show, well, you can watch the show and you can actually be in the show. You can forget that you're in a movie theater and you're in that story. You feel the feelings of what the actors feel. And you could almost imagine being an actor in there. You're in the room.
Exactly.
And that is that's the reality. That's the feeling of the realness of it.
Let me cap this off, because what you're talking about is something called an allegorical scenario. Everything we humans observe, well, that's created by another human, is creating some sort of allegory. And so we go back in time and we say, okay, Eve invented language and communication, period. It was a female. It was a female because the female was in charge of protecting the child. Why? Because the child was birthed by the female, all right? And so if Eve did not have a way of instructing that child not to do this and not to do that, it would not have survived. So we self-selected through evolution. But where were the first stories held? They were held up in the night sky. The first archival system was the stars, the constellations. We think those constellations are somewhat astrological, and people were trying to predict the future. Maybe, but the real reason we shaped out things in the sky was when we saw a horse or a bison. What we were doing was reminding ourselves of what that story represented, and those stories had deep allegories. And when you go back and you read these stories with a new sense of understanding, you can now receive the transmission. I'm tuning you in on, this is going to sound funny, I'm tuning you in on a new frequency. It's a very, very powerful thing. I cannot stress how important this is for anybody listening. If I die and I only have one thing I've told you, it's this. Every single story has layers of allegories in it. The older the story, even though there's a lot of noise to the signal, there are allegories that you can learn from that are immensely important to you right now at this moment. Those allegories are here to save. They're here to save you, and I really mean that in a very guttural sense. They're here to tell you about the human journey. And that's
pretty profound, Brian. To say you have one, if that's the one idea, that's a big idea. That's a big statement. Yeah.
So the most important thing that I have discovered is human stories and storytelling. And that's why I've dedicated most of my life into doing that. And last week, or earlier this week, I presented for the very first time publicly how this is going to impact the future human and computer interaction. And unfortunately, only the first couple of minutes of that speech was preserved. I hope to give it more in the future. But the premise is really quite simple. When you take a very, very long view of wisdom and you try to understand what's really been going on since the beginning of time, you almost fall to an emotional tear. I see this all the time when I talk to people. When you realize, I'll give you one more example. I know we got to go. A lot of people say, wow, those pyramids, what were they there for? There has to be the ego of the king. Of course. Yeah, of course. Well, let's go into the pyramids. The king who spent who knows how many lives and how many hours, how many years, how many decades, how many hundreds of years, because it was not produced in 50 years. It was hundreds of years. And then that whole timeline shifts. And let's not get into aliens or any of this other stuff. But let's just say humans created this. Okay, it was a king. It was his ego. Why is his name not written on a single stone in any of the grand pyramids on the Giza Plateau? Not one. Okay, so let's assume it's humans again. So it's got to be saying something. When we build something, it's transmitting a message, right? Megalithic structures are always transmitting a message. They don't just build them because. Those folks were actually transmitting messages. What was the message they were trying to say to future generations? Now, you can laugh and say that's an old story and it doesn't apply to me. Great. Then you don't need to hear that message. But if you do want to open your mind and say, okay, they're trying to tell us something, and we can go to the standard, again, alien thing, or we can take a step back and say, what can we learn from it? Well, first, it was defaced by a lot of cultures who didn't like what it represented. So the writing that was on the external structure of, let's call it the Great Pyramid, for lack of a better term, but there's other names you can call it. There was writing on the white outer layer of those pyramids. They didn't look unconstructed like they do today. There was writing from the top to the bottom, not Egyptian writing that people have not still been able to decode. No, not many people know this. So, okay. Brian, you're saying, is it the king's writing? No, it has nothing to do with the king. We know that.
So what do you feel is the story then, or what's the takeaway idea?
Here's in a couple of seconds left. Here's the one thing I can tell you. And you can go to Snopes, and of course, Snopes and Wikipedia are the entire top level of all human wisdom. Only the really wise debunkers go to these places. And I'm kidding you, because what people do at these sites is retransmit the current status quo. Those folks are the transmitters of the status quo. So I'm going to tell you a little story, and it's very easy to understand. The pyramids are aligned in a line of three. And if you look above your head, there's only one visible stellar constellation at our line of three that are precisely aligned, and it's Orion's belt. So Orion's belt mirror what is on the ground in Egypt. Now, that's interesting for some people. Now, run to Snopes, and they'll tell you that that's not true. They'll say it's randomly you can find 3 stars like that. That's utter bullshit. You cannot find randomly 3 stars like that in the exact order. And they will tell you, well, it was off by a little bit. They're off by about 1 or 2 degrees on one of the pyramids. But the sizes are relatively equal to the brightness of those stars. Interesting. But they're off by 1. Well, why are they off? Let me explain this. Why are they off by 1 degree on one pyramid? Maybe it was built when that star was shifted by that amount. And maybe that precise alignment, everything else about the pyramid is absolutely precise. It is off by a minute amount to the true north of this planet. It is equal to the mass of this planet. The pyramids divide the physical mass of this entire planet. I'm not coming to any conclusion about aliens. Don't assume that I have some hidden agenda. Just take this information and know that I'm giving you some form of wisdom right now. Now, there's an alignment from on the ground. What's above is below, is one of the most ancient knowledges that were transmitted. So it's telling you I have the structure that I made to survive the sands of time, and I've aligned it to a series of stars. And that's all we have right now. Everything else is conjecture to a certain level. Some conjecture is very compelling, but I'm giving you only that bit of information. And it's not to confuse you. It's to actually give you strength to understand that humanity and humans actually love each other, and they're saying something to us in the future. Unfortunately,
I like that
the noise is so loud that we can't get the signal anymore. And whoever defaced the pyramid or pyramids, whoever defaced it may have had an agenda to make sure we don't get that story. That's your conspiracy. Go down that rabbit hole. I'm not going there right now. But I am telling you, you cannot belie the fact of 2 things. Those pyramids are aligned to a stellar constellation, and that took an enormous amount of energy to do in a time when people had copper chisels that bent the moment you tried to cut granite.
Yeah, that is pretty amazing. And humans, I think, also given enough time, will destroy anything we create.
And that's why megalithic structures are designed to communicate a message into time, because these folks were wise. They had wisdom. They knew that nothing would be able to transmit a message better than a whole lot of rocks that would take many more. See, people who are destroyers, they are lazy individuals. Destroyers, look around you. We only have 2 types of people in this world, creators or destroyers. And you can define yourself. I'm not defining you. Either you create things or you destroy them. But I say when you start debunking things, you may be a destroyer, because you may not want to be able to receive the information, and you may, in fact, contribute to destroying that information. So professional debunkers, I do have a problem with.
I will say that is a conversation that warrants a lot more time, and it is a fascinating gateway and threshold into that world of thought and study. And there seems to be many different people with many different perspectives with different levels of believability and confidence, but there is undoubtedly some giant mystery and some giant story there that we're going to pause.
Anybody, I don't want to tell anybody, you need to believe me. I'm not saying that.
No. But I mean, for someone as prolific a writer and thinker and reader as you, there's a great bit of momentum going in that direction.
Yeah,
so
I use Occam's razor.
I'm going to dive in.
I use Occam's razor of believability. Would you rather believe it's just random? Because Occam's razor tells you that the most logical explanation is likely the most truthful explanation. That is not randomness.
I think we have a show called Occam's Razor, actually. All right, but on that note, Faisal, Brian, this has been a fantastic conversation, and we will keep this thread going to the next time.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Take care. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The views and opinions expressed on any program are those of the hosts, co-hosts, and guests appearing on the show and do not necessarily reflect the view of the owners and producers of the show. Paid advertisements in form of audio announcements may appear throughout the show, including this one. Advertising can also include print and other digital formats. The owners and producers of Around the Coin do not endorse or evaluate the advertised product, service, or company, nor any of the claims made by the advertisement. All programs are subject to a one-time charge for professional editing fees, for which the interviewing guest or guests may have contributed towards. The owners, producers, hosts, co-hosts, and guests on the show are not financial advisors. Any investment advice or opinion cited during the show is for information purposes only. None of the content is intended to be investment advice. Seek a duly licensed professional for investment advice. If you believe there's been any violation of your copyright, trademark, service mark, or any other type of intellectual property, please inform us in writing by sending an email to legal@aroundthecoin.com.